Mark chapter 16, those verses 1 to 8, it's a passage all about shocks, unexpected surprises, and those kind of shocks that, are etched on the person's mind forever. I was thinking about perhaps the shocks you and I may have experienced that have really shook the world. I'm sure you can remember where you were on 9/11 when the news broke. I can, and it's just one of those horrible, unexpected surprises. Or perhaps you can remember where you were when Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed in the car crash in 1996. Can you remember where you were? Yep, I can. It's etched on my mind because of the shock and the horror of that news as it broke. Or perhaps you can remember, let's see, the assassination of JFK Kennedy. 1963, Dallas, Texas. I can't, I wasn't around then, 63. But if you're old enough, can you remember where you were? Right, because of the shock of it. And as JFK was assassinated. And that's the feel here in Mark chapter 16. These women and all that happened that very first Easter Sunday, as we now know it. The shock of it. It made such an impact. And I want us to think about these verses and what it means for you and I today. We believe that Jesus rose again. Let's look at these verses then. Mark chapter 16. Now the other Gospels, Mark and Luke and John, they add more detail to what happened on that first Easter Sunday morning. Mark, in his usual sort of style, he's very punchy and pacey and to the point. And that's the way he is. He's very direct. He goes straight in. And like he does at the start of his Gospel, that's his way. Just to ask some basic questions first of all about what happened before we think about what it means. First of all, who went to the tomb? We think about who and why and when and what. Who went? Who went to the tomb that morning? Well, verse 1 tells us the women went. The women went to that tomb. Mary Magdalene, and also we read it, Mary the mother of James and Salome. Mary Magdalene, we don't know much about the other women, but Mary Magdalene was someone who Jesus had cured from 7 demons, 7 evil spirits that were in her life. So these women were very, very devoted to Jesus, very faithful. And there they are, that first Sunday morning, as they make their way to the tomb. Second question, why did they go? Why did they go to that tomb? They went to anoint the body of Jesus. Jesus is dead. And we thought last week, didn't we? We looked particularly at the facts, the accounts, even accounts outside of the Gospels that verified Jesus was dead and buried. They went to the purpose to anoint the corpse. And that was the customary thing to do in those days. If you lived in first century Palestine, particularly part of the Jewish culture, you would go to anoint your loved one, deceased one, up to 3 days after burial, and to anoint the body with spices. And often the third day was the height of mourning and grieving for the close ones of the deceased. That's what the women did. It was their tradition. And they need to make sure that the person was truly dead. Now, that's why they went. When did they go? When did they go to the tomb? Because Jesus was murdered on a Friday, buried on a Friday. You'd think the women would go the following day, wouldn't you, on the Saturday morning? But they went the Sunday instead. Why? Because to them, well, it was the Sabbath day, which of course was Saturday in the Jewish custom. And we read how they waited. They rested on the Sabbath day because, you see, it was against their Jewish law to touch a dead body on the Sabbath. So these women, they had to wait. And we read how, verse 1, when the Sabbath was over, they went. That Sunday morning, the first day of the week. And the women, they left their homes, probably still in the darkness. And as they made their way along the alleyways of Jerusalem, outside the city wall, as the sun rose, as we read there how it was just after sunrise, as the first rays of the sun broke onto the streets, the women made their way to the tomb. And the tomb was the same place where Jesus had been crucified. And there was a garden there. And a man called Joseph of Arimathea, he had really donated his own tomb that was newly cut from the rock, and he had buried Jesus there. So that's where they went. Last question, before we think further. What was the problem that these women were going to encounter upon arrival at the tomb? We read there in verse 3, on their way, they're kind of scratching their heads. They kind of realise, hang on a minute, how are we going to go into the tomb? Because the stone had been rolled in front of the entrance. Who's going to move the stone, they say? Who's going to move it? Now, this stone is heavy. It weighs a ton. And as was custom, they would roll it in front of the entrance, usually on the third day. But the Jewish and Roman authorities, they did it immediately. They closed off the entrance to the tomb. They rolled it into the groove, this stone in front of the entrance, and it was sealed. It was actually sealed. That's what Pilate and the Roman authorities issued. They said it must be sealed. Who's going to move it? That was their problem. So there we are. Who, why, when, and what. Now, they arrive at the tomb, and here's where the shocks begin to happen. These unexpected surprises begin to impact them, one after the other. The first shock is this. They arrive, and the stone's been rolled away. And that phrase, rolled away, verse 4, they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. That phrase, rolled away, in the original language that Mark's Gospel was written in, literally means hurled out. Wow. They arrived, and there was this stone hurled out somewhere else in the vicinity. What had happened? Well, of course, we know that it was a divine touch that had occurred, a divine moment that had blasted this stone away. According to one early manuscript, it would take at least 20 men to move that stone. 20 men. I'm tempted to get 20 men out to the front, just kind of for us to visualise it. You know, sort of a rugby scrum type of picture, but there's not enough room. 20 men hurled away was that stone. That was the first shock. The second shock, as these women turned up, the second shock was this. They confronted a young man. As they entered the tomb, in verse 5, they confronted this young man dressed in white. And the other Gospels tell us, for example, in Matthew's Gospel, how his clothing gleamed and was white as snow. This was an angelic presence. This was an angel. And in fact, we read in Matthew's Gospel, you see, this is where all the details come in to build up the picture. In Matthew's Gospel, we read how it was the angel who threw the stone away, and the guard that had been posted, by Pilate and the Roman authorities, they, at the sight of this angel, in fact, just to add to the drama, Luke says it was two angels. At the sight of what had happened, there was an earthquake. The Roman soldiers, as hard as they were, hard as nails, they fainted. And the description is in Matthew's Gospel, they shook and became like dead men. Now, do you see the picture? That first Easter Sunday morning, these women who up to press they'd been looking on, looking at the cross, watching Jesus die, watching him, his body being taken down, watching him buried. They kept a distance, they watched. They went to anoint the body. They arrive, there's these Roman soldiers sort of strewn around the place, unless they've come round and they've run off. And actually they got paid off by the Roman authorities not to say anything, a huge sum of money. There's the stone rolled away, and they are confronted by this young man. Now an angel, we thought about this at Q&As at Steph's on Tuesday, didn't we, those who were there? What's an angel? The word angel means messenger. The angel had a message. What was the message? The message was this, verse 6 and verse 7. And by the way, we read in one of the other Gospels, the women bowed with their faces to the ground before these angels. The angel says, this young man says, and here's the third shock. This unexpected surprise. Are you with me? You're with me? Good. Here it comes. Are you ready? Don't be alarmed, said the angel, the young man. You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, He is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you'll see him just as he told you. Wow. What news. News that indeed shook the world. And it began with these women. And you know, as I've been preparing this message, I've been particularly convicted by those words. He is going ahead of you into Galilee, just as he told you. Because you know what? Go back, Mark chapter 14. Jesus, the Thursday night before the Sunday, he prepared his followers for his death, the Lord's Supper, or the Last Supper, as it was described. And then he said, this is before he died, Mark chapter 14, verse 28, he says, after I have risen, I'll go ahead of you into Galilee. And lo and behold, that's what happens. Amazing, isn't it? I mean, it's like me saying to you, okay, this coming Thursday, okay, I'm going to be handed over to some people, and on Friday they're going to kill me. I'm going to be murdered. Yes, I've planned it all, but they're going to torture me and kill me. But don't worry, because on Sunday, next Sunday, I'll see you. In fact, I'll meet you at the marketplace in Barnsley. All right? I'll rise. I'll see you at the marketplace in Barnsley on Sunday. Now, you'd probably say to me, hang on, Mark. You're going crazy. What are you on about? Coming back to life and we'll meet again, wherever. That's what Jesus said. And of course, it didn't really register with them until Easter Sunday morning when the angel said those words, just as he told you. And that's when the pennies start to drop. That's when the alarm bells begin to ring. That very first Easter Sunday morning. Jesus' word comes true. He's in control. Now, listen. What does this all mean for you and me? For you and I? All these shocks. These unexpected surprises. It turns their lives upside down, inside out. And what a transition from Good Friday to Easter Sunday. I mean, from Mark chapter 15 to Mark chapter 16. Mark chapter 15, you've got the women, it's full of despair. You know, perhaps you've been there sometime. It's, in the pits of despair, doom and gloom. That might be you today. And we read how the women on that Good Friday, we just read, they were there. They saw it all, the crucifixion. What despair, what anguish. And then we have the transition of Easter Sunday. And how that very last verse of our passage, verse 8, notice how Mark describes it in his gospel. He says, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Now, just as an aside, we have verses 9 to 20, which somebody else has added to the gospel. Somebody's rounded off the gospel, because Mark finishes so abruptly at verse 8. That's his style. He begins abruptly in his gospel, very first verse of chapter 1, and he finishes abruptly, unless his finishing of Mark's gospel was lost or destroyed, the last bit written on papyrus. But I think he finished there. Verse 8. The women run. Confusion. Women and men running here and there. There's fear. There's elation. There's confusion. And for a short while, the women were dumbstruck. Do you get the feel of what's happening? They are dumbstruck because of what they've experienced. But Mark finishes there. That's it. Full stop. And you might be saying to yourself, what happened next? What happened next? Perhaps you've never heard really about the message of Easter, the good news of Jesus. What happened next? It's as if Mark is saying, it's open-ended. Over to you. Over to you. What do you make of the resurrection? How are you going to respond? You might just think, oh, this is a fairy tale, alongside the Easter bunny and the Easter eggs. Or is it truly, really and truly, a happy ending? Your choice. Is it true or false? Is this just the end, or is it just the beginning? It might be. It's just the beginning for you, what happened here. You know, I reckon deep down you long for a fairy tale ending to your life. Do you know what I mean? Deep down you long for that fairy tale ending to your life, which, if it's like most lives, it's full of misery and pain and suffering and loneliness, tears, disappointments, disillusionments, discontentment, and so on and so forth. You long for that happy ending to your life, like a fairy tale ending. I mean, why do people flock to the cinemas to watch films that have, you know, they lived happily ever after endings? So many films. I was going through our kids' rack of DVDs. So many of them have got this sort of fairy tale ending. In fact, I wrote a list. I just jotted them all down, some of them. These are kids' films, okay, so. Tangled, Oliver, Wizard of Oz, Star Wars. In fact, all 6 of them. The 2 trilogies. Toy Story, 1, 2 and 3. Black Beauty, Ice Age, The Chronicles of Narnia, Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, The Dawn Treader, Prince Caspian, Shrek. Anybody watch Shrek? 1, 2 and 3. The Mask of Zorro, Lord of the Rings, the trilogy, Indiana Jones. And, you know, I mean, DVDs are so cheap to buy these days. But in all those films, there's a happy ending where good triumphs over evil and they live happily ever after. But of course, it's all fairy tale stuff. It's like in The Lord of the Rings where, I think it's one of the hobbits, says to Gandalf, and of course Gandalf is supposedly dead, he's dropped off the end of that cliff, whatever it was, and I think it's one of the hobbits says, Gandalf, I thought you're dead. I thought you were dead. Is everything sad going to come untrue? What's happened to the world? Is everything sad going to come untrue? You see, directors of films, movies, authors of books, actually they're just expressing what you long for. Because what you long for is fulfillment, friendship, happiness, peace, joy, and of course, above all, life. Life in all its fullness. Deep down, that's what you long for. And you hope above all hopes that death is not the end. You hope above all hopes that actually you'll live forever. Happily ever after. Deep down, I bet you do. I do. But the problem with all these films and so on, it's just fairy tale stuff. And of course, for a moment, it's escapism and it's great. But actually, you come out of the cinema and the cold air hits you and you're back to reality, aren't you? Back to the life of the real world. But let me say this, that in Jesus Christ, all that you long for deep down comes true. It comes true. Jesus brings all these longings that you desire. He brings them to realization in your life. That's the good news, because he rose from the dead. It happened historically, and it can be applied to your life today. And so as I finish, as one, let me say this, as one pastor put it, Jesus went into the tomb so we can be raised out of it. You're going to die. I'm sorry. I'm going to die. We're all destined for death. But Jesus went into the tomb so that you and I can be raised out of it. Now that's good news, and that's the message of Easter, and we know this because Jesus rose from the dead. It's the first fruits of the life to come. And so, what I want to challenge you today to do is this, is I want you to put your faith in Jesus, to trust him, because that's where the hope is. One day he shall return, and he shall bring heaven to earth. And whilst we have a measure of all that Jesus can bring, you know, the fairy tale stuff, that becomes true, we have a measure of that now, but when Jesus returns, we shall have all those wonderful longings and desires come true in all their fullness. That's when Jesus returns. In the meantime, fix your eyes on Jesus, because when you do that, he'll spur you on. You'll be motivated in your life. And through all the ups and downs, Jesus will be there. Listen, let me tell you a story, true story, of a very famous swimmer. And her name, Florence Chadwick. And she was a long-distance swimmer. She was an American, and she was the first woman ever, do you know what I'm going to say, anybody know? To swim the English Channel. It was a summer's day in 1950. Sometime later, she made the attempt to swim a 21-mile stretch in California called the Catalina Channel. And, you know, after 15 hours and 55 minutes of swimming, she only had half a mile to go. Just half a mile after swimming for nearly 16 hours. I can't even stay in the bath for more than 20 minutes. And she was cheered on. There was her family and friends in boats surrounding her, cheering her on. But she gave up. And she asked to be taken out of the water. And nobody could believe it. Why did she do this? And in the interview later, she said it was because of the fog. It was because of the fog. And she said, what transpired was this. She said, if only I could see the shoreline. If only I could see the shore, I know I would have made it. You see what happened? She couldn't see the finishing line. And so she felt she was like she was getting nowhere. And, her limbs and her arms were aching, and she gave up. Now, transfer that to your life. It might be that you just want to give up because of the fog in your life. Because of evil, because of all the trials and temptations in your life, the pain, and so much more. Fix your eyes on Jesus, because he has risen. He's standing, as it were, metaphorically speaking, on the shore. He's in heaven. Fix your eyes on him, because one day he'll welcome you. Keep going. But you've got to put your faith in him. You've got to trust him. You've got to embrace him. My time is up. Listen. Are you a spectator or are you a player? Are you a spectator or are you a player? The women were looking on. They were spectators. And then suddenly they became players. They became involved in this amazing Easter message as we now know it. What about you? Are you a player? Or are you a spectator? You just look on. You're there on the fringes of it. You come to Gateway perhaps out of habit, or perhaps you're here because it's Easter Sunday to pay your respects. Perhaps your Jesus is still trapped in church life and he's yet to break free. Are you a spectator? Are you just looking on? Because if you are, you need to be a player. Like these women, as that drama unfolded. They embraced the risen Jesus and their lives were changed. Be a player. Get involved. Experience Jesus. Believe in him. Turn away from hopelessness without God in your life and the sin in your life and turn to God. Get involved in Gateway Church. Well, there's a lot more I could say. 2 years ago, I'll finish on this, I'm sorry. 2 years ago, on Easter Sunday, we launched as Gateway Church. And since then, amazing things have happened. And some of you have been players since then. And we've seen amazing things happen. We've seen God, launch the debt counselling service. Lives changed through that. We've seen God launch the food bank through Gateway people. We even had the Member of Parliament come here to look at the food bank, and he wrote a letter to the Prime Minister about the Gateway Food Bank. Isn't that amazing? Even the Prime Minister has heard of Gateway Food Bank. We've been given a building, free, and so much more. And some of you have been players, but others of you are looking on. Embrace Jesus. Put your trust in him. Fix your eyes on him. Because that's where the true hope is, when all your longings will come true. It's not a fairy tale. 1 minute break. And then we'll have just a few minutes of Q&As. And during the break, during the interval, it's just 1 minute. As always, just ask yourself, what difference does the resurrection of Jesus make to you? You might want to speak to your neighbour, or just quietly sit. What difference does it make to you? Or you might want to think about a question that you want to form a position in your mind that you can fire at me. Because it's your chance to get back to me with your questions, all right? So just a minute, and then a short time of Q&As before we finish off.